materials case, which was initiated by the EU against Indonesia after Indonesia fully implemented its policy of banning exports of nickel ore back in 2020. So the implications of the final outcome of this case will be really critical in shaping the energy and mineral policies of similarly situated countries such as India, and of course other developing economies like my own, the Philippines, and they are closely monitoring this case, which is currently pending before the appellate body of the WTO. So why so much ado about nickel? I think that's the question that we wanted to answer today. So while nickel has been traditionally used for stainless steel production, around 70% is allocated to this industry. It has gained significant traction actually in role, and it has a very important role in climate change mitigation efforts. And in fact, according to the Nickel Institute, the properties of nickel actually facilitate the deployment of an entire spectrum of clean energy technologies. So for example, nickel content in batteries, increasing that can actually prolong the life and storage capacity. And of course, this has countries such as the developed economies actually fear that with these technological breakthroughs, developing economies will shut them out of the cheaper ore market and begin to impose some form of restrictions, not just on the ore, which Indonesia has done, but the more expensive first-use nickel products as well. So what I will do is I will first present, so Jerry, can you please go back? Okay, thank you. So what I will do is I will first present to you the why Indonesia has become more protective of its industry, particularly the ore mining industry. And in fact, with this ban, the UNCTAD back in 2017 already said that this gamble is actually paying off and will likely allow Indonesia to achieve its goals. So I will be talking about that primarily, and then Jerry will then go and introduce to you the Indonesia raw materials case, and also the panel ruling and case updates. Jerry was one of the lawyers which was sort of prosecuting this case before the WTO. And I will then come back with comments on the panel's ruling, and then we will end with some brief comments and final thoughts on the designing compliant exceptional measures. And so why has the Indonesian President Joko Widodo actually pushed this ban despite the high risk of being found non-compliant with WTO trade rules? And according to him, the answer is really very simple. He is invoking resource nationalism and the right to exercise control of the raw materials for the Indonesian people. And this is evident from his pronouncements. And even back in January, that he said that Indonesia will never become a developed economy if it continues to just explore or export nickel. And in fact, to prove his point, he declared or announced that since Indonesia actually imposed the ban, the export value of nickel of Indonesia has increased actually from $1 billion to $21 billion. So it's a very, very big increase. So there is indeed a very strong case for Chair, can you please go to the next slide? There's indeed a very strong case for the export ban. And in fact, we have prepared a slide for you, a hypothetical scenario where you can actually see that assuming that that a particular country is able to mine, let's say 100,000 metric tons of nickel ore at their current prices. So the nickel ore itself is only costs around $69 per metric ton, and with 100,000, an all ore strategy, export strategy, will only earn you around $6.9 million. While a mixed strategy or even a full refined strategy export strategy will actually earn you a very whopping increase, which was within the range that was provided for by the president of Indonesia, ranging from around 1,600 to 3,000. So according to Indonesia, its main reason that it is authorized to actually impose the ban as the country has permanent sovereignty over the use and control of its natural resources. And therefore, the increase in this export value will not only enable the country to industrialize and become a developed economy, but more importantly, it will fund a number of economic and social programs, development programs for the country. And so with that, I turn the screen over to Jerry, and she will discuss the case and the panel ruling.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. Basically, for my part, I will focus on the case. So I mean, like if we see the case timeline here, the case started back in 2019, and then the panel, they just circulated the report back in December 2022. For measure at issue, basically there are two measures discussed in these proceedings. The first one is export prohibitions. So if we see from our internal regulation, we have three different regime on how the government regulates about these export prohibitions. So we have January 2014, we have 2017 until 2019, where Indonesia allow the exportation of nickel ore below 1.7. But I mean, like for this case, they require additional recommendation from the Director General. And then the last development, January 2020, the government banned all export of nickel ore. Another major at issue, basically this is a domestic processing requirement where the government require all mining companies to refine the materials before they can export it to outside Indonesia. For this case proceedings, the EU challenged two export ban as well as DPR to be inconsistent with Article 11.1 of the GATT 1994. And then there are three elements, there are three articles that we discussed during the proceedings. The first one is the Article 11 under quantitative restriction, as well as Article 11.2 to exclude the application of Article 11, as well as the justification under Article 20B. For Article 11.1, basically, the discussion when we talk about the export prohibition, Indonesia doesn't dispute the fact that this measure really prohibit the export of nickel ore. But for DPR, we had a quite different approach when we talk about export prohibition, because we try to argue that DPR is an internal requirement and shouldn't be assessed under Article 11, but instead it should be assessed under Article 3.4 of the GATT 94. The reason why, because we say that the DPR is not a precondition for the exportation, and then the DPR, they sort of like operate independently on top of the export ban. And then for the limiting effect, we mentioned about, we provided some data about the relaxation. So we have two periods in our regulation that we allow the exportation of nickel ore, especially the low-grade nickel ore. But I mean, like for this part, the panel mentioned that the DPR should be assessed under Article 11 of quantitative restriction, because basically the policy, they don't really need to be explicitly mentioned that this prohibit the exportation, but the operation of the measure itself sort of like the affect the export prohibition. That's why for these measures, DPR as well as export prohibition, they classified into other measures that should be assessed under Article 11.1. Move to Article 11.2. Basically, there are three elements that should be assessed. The first one is essential, as well as temporary, and the last one will be critical shortage. For this essential, we rely the interpretation of the panel in previous case, which is China raw materials, that mentioned that essential can be interpreted as As long as the commodity, as long as the respondent can prove that the commodity is sort of like the input in the main industry in the country and also important for the country's economy. For this part, we delivered 3 different evidence to the panel. The first one, we show the importance of mining, especially in some parts of Indonesia that produce nickel ore. We show the substantial portion of the GDP, especially for those regions. And the second one, we highlight the part that nickel is a major input for steel industry in Indonesia, and we relate it with the GDP, the industrial GDP in Indonesia. The last one, we also mentioned about the importance of nickel for the development of our EV industry in Indonesia, where the government tried to build an ecosystem for EV battery production in Indonesia. And then for this part, panel mentioned that for this GDP, the contribution to the regional GDP as well as the industrial GDP in Asia, the panel mentioned that the stainless steel industry is currently a minor part of Indonesia's economy because they refer as they only cover for 3.94% of the total industrial GDP. And the panel mentioned that Indonesia has not presented the evidence on how the stainless steel industry as well as the EV batteries import will be important for other industry in Indonesia. For the temporarily applied, we divided our arguments into 2 parts. The first one, with regards to the export prohibitions, we highlight that we have 2 periods of relaxation where the mining company, they can export their nickel ore, especially when the regulation allow the low-grade nickel ore to be exported outside Indonesia. And the second part for the DPR, because basically in our initial discussion, we argued that this measure should be covered under Article 3.4 of the GATT 94 instead of Article 11 of quantitative restriction. So the panel analyzed it, they mentioned that no indication when those regulation will be expired. So the panel
ಕೆಲ ದಿನಗಳ ಕ್ಲಾಸಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಏನ್ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಇದೆಯೋ ಅದು ಮಾತ್ರ ಡಿಸ್ಕಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ.
Kindly mute yourself.
Okay, I'll continue the presentation. So the panel assessed that basically in export prohibition as well as domestic processing requirement, there is no specific or explicit regulation that states that when these 2 measures will be expired. So the panel say that we cannot say your regulations as in temporarily applied. The last one, when we talk about critical shortage, we mentioned about 6 years total lifespan of nickel ore based on the current production and consumption levels without taking into account the development of EV battery in Indonesia that will be happening soon. And then the panel said that the future prediction or the assumption cannot be used to assess the critical shortage on this matter. For the justification, Indonesia decided to use Article 20D instead of like Article 20B. And we divided our discussion into 2 parts when we talk about the measures are designed to secure compliance. For this part, there are 3 elements that we need to prove. We need to describe the laws and regulations. The second part will be whether the laws and regulation they are consistent with GATT 1994. And the last one, whether the measure designed to secure compliance. For this part, when we talk about the laws and regulation that we will use as our benchmark for this claim, we mentioned 3 different regulations. But I mean, like when we group it into some points, we highlight about sustainable mining requirements as well as the conservation of natural resources. So when the panel analyzed this, the panel agreed that this only the sustainable mining requirements that can be classified as laws and regulations, while the conservation of natural resources cannot be used as the laws and regulation for this benchmark. And then for this one, when we talk about the secure compliance, the panel said that although, for this claim, Indonesia submitted some data, some evidence where we show that because of these two regulations, we managed to reduce the illegal mining. We try to build the ecosystem between the mining companies as well as the smelters to to make sure that the sustainable mining requirements on this part. And then the panel decided that Indonesia has demonstrated that these measures are measures to secure compliance with Article 96C of the mining law within the meaning of Article 20D of the GATT 1994. And then when we talk about necessary part, there are two sub-elements that should be assessed. And then for the trade restrictiveness, basically the panel say that export prohibition is the highest form of trade restrictive. So the panel directly proceed to the DPR to assess whether this effect of the measure really restrictive the trade. And the panel said, yeah, these two measures, basically they have this trade restrictive. So we directly discuss the contribution of the EP and as well as the DPR. For the contribution, basically we highlight the part where we need to show that the genuine relationship between the measure as well as the objective pursuit. And then as we highlight before, when we talk about the sustainable mining requirement, we submitted some evidence that, especially for the export prohibition, when we apply this export prohibition, we show that when we reduce the nickel extraction in Indonesia, it shows that the compliance, when we talk about the environmental standard, increase, as well as when we talk about DPR, we submitted some evidence. We show that we have some contract between the mining company as well as the smelter to show that we are trying to create ecosystem in the long term to achieve the sustainable mining practice. And then for this part, EU has the burden of proof. EU has the obligation to show that there is alternative measure to achieve the same objective. And then for this claim, the EU submitted the export authorization that basically will allow the exportation of nickel ore subject to compliance with the relevant environmental standards. But for this discussion, we mentioned that we already have this quite the same standards. And we had discussion on how our current regulation really differ from the proposal submitted by the EU. I think that's all from my side. I will return it to Ms. Jess to continue the discussion on the panel ruling.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry. So I will now go into our comments, Jerry's and my comments on the panel ruling. So as Indonesia's only questioned the DPR and has accepted the export prohibition ruling. So although it doesn't really say that because they made a qualification in their submission. So our first comment on the issue of whether the DPR is an internal measure that is outside the scope of Article 1, we actually are saying that for both Jerry and I, that the issue of ore smelting is actually the elephant in the room that the WTO panel did not quite address. And so for us, it is, the panel and the WTO just assumed that by virtue of the fact that the ores are taken out of the ground, there is already a duty to export. But we raised two questions which we hope the appellate body will consider. So this goes into the relationship of the issue of international law, the broader international law, such as, for example, the right of a people to its permanent sovereignty over its natural resources. And so we asked the question whether the right to refine nickel as a condition for nickel exportation is an assertion of the right to permanent sovereignty over natural resources that is accommodated by the GATT. And we do this and we ask this question because Pascal Lamy, the former general director, Director General of the WTO actually said that the WTO regime sources of law is not really just limited to the WTO covered agreements. And in fact, he also noted that these rules were not written primarily with natural resources and resource markets as primary focus. And so what happens when these rules are put together, sometimes the mixture is not always coherent. And so we hope that the panel, that the appellate body will look into this. And so the second question that we want to ask is the panel authorized to interpret and apply GATT rules to an underlying issue which may not really be purely trade, that deprives the country of resources and the right to capture the economic rents from a first use processing such as smelting. Why do we ask this? Because when you use nickel cannot be used without being smelted. And a country such as Indonesia should be able to get the rents, and you saw the numbers are astronomical from the use of from the value that it's extracted from refining. So the third question that we want to ask is, even if it is within the scope of Article 11.1, does the DPR, which effectively operates, did the panel actually rightly make the proper assessment? Because if we really look closer into the panel's decision, as Jerry has already said, as the fact that it is an export prohibition already equates to a trade restrictive measure in violation of Article 11.1. And we say that this is a mechanistic finding, and the fact that it has a limiting effect is really a foregone conclusion, is a circuitous form of reasoning. And so we want to, hopefully the appellate body will really look at whether or not the panel erred actually in limiting and in relying on the limiting effect on the export ban and the DPR themselves. So we suggest that, and we hope that the appellate body will expand the analysis from a single product to a multi-product focus, and reframe the issue perhaps to availability of nickel for first use by downstream nickel industries. And of course, the basic question that we ask related to natural resources sovereignty is that, will the limiting effect finding operate to recognize a duty under the GATT to protect and promote and ensure the viability of smelting companies and smelting providers in other countries, where they know that they may find limits or they may find that they would not have enough access to ore, and which countries would limit. So to go to the next question and the next set of comments that we have, so we hope that the appellate body would also look into the issue of whether or not, from Indonesia's point of view, whether it has a right to actually participate in the smelting industry. So we hope that the panel will then look into whether or not the right to refine ore is actually which is not inconsistent with WTO rules, because in fact the WTO in fact encourages countries to pursue some form of combination of either export diversification, building forward linkages, and building backward linkages, which is an example of the issue of smelting. So to go to our final slide, our final point that we want to take as we close our presentation, there are implications for India and developing economies as far as designing and implementing W-compliant exceptional measures. So we do know that the WTO system ensures smooth, predictable, and free trade flows via the covered agreements, and these are the ground rules. But we do also know that any trade that must occur, and our esteemed professors have discussed this, but we do hope that countries such as Philippines and Indonesia would really build capacity and capability to design and implement exceptional policies and measures in a coherent manner. And to do this, they must have a well-codified, documented all-government approach, because we know from a third world perspective, and particularly we are from the Eastern cultures. In Eastern cultures, our social orientation and collective orientation almost always impacts our, the fundamental aspects of our reasoning. And so therefore we have many assumptions, for example, and we do recognize that we make tacit assumptions that we thought was already in our law, but we failed perhaps to include. And the test, for example, that there has to be let's say a statement in the law that would link so that it would prove, for example, the design of the law, and that it really is to realize the goal of environmental protection. So we do hope that our countries will be able to really up the game, so to speak, before the WTO, and we are able to strengthen our capacity, including India, in this area. So thank you. That ends our presentation. Thank you very much.